And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome to Alaska Weather. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Sunday, March 9th, 2025. And we'll start, as we usually do here, with the state of the sea ice. And ice is extensive throughout the northern half of the Bering Sea. We have had some brisker winds that are going to be impacting areas along the Bering Strait and further south, but at least in the time being, we've had a push of a little milder air up into Bristol Bay. We find the ice has melted off there, as well as into Upper Cook Inlet, because temperatures here up through Upper Cook Inlet have been up near 40 degrees the past few days, and we could still squeak out another day around 40 for Monday. But we expect the ice to more or less stay in place where it is now. There is a belt of stronger winds coming up along the Aleutians that has more of a westerly component, whereas further north we're going to have an offshore and then northerly component to the winds as we especially get up there through the Bering Strait. So late tonight into Monday morning, we have this occluded front that's going to push up into the Panhandle with some snow, rain, and wind. And that system will then push further inland and tend to weaken as we get into later Monday and Tuesday. Here's the initial low that came up out of the North Pacific into the southwest Bering, and late tonight, early Monday morning, located over the central Bering. This low will be passing just north of St. Paul as we go through Monday afternoon. So we've had a push of a little milder air up into the southwest interior. That'll help to bring a little milder air up to St. Lawrence as a result. But the areas of snow that were initially along this front have diminished, become more patchy and light in nature. Monday afternoon, the occluded front's up here along through the Panhandle. There's a winter weather advisory for the southern Panhandle late this Sunday night. Through early Monday afternoon, there could be 2 to 4 inches of sloppy, wet snow, perhaps a little more in some of the higher elevations. And then by the time we get into Tuesday, that front just kind of washes out with a remnant low here in the southwestern Gulf. The next weather system of consequence well southwest of the Aleutians Tuesday afternoon. And generally northern parts of the state will feature weak high pressure and drier conditions. Though as we go through the upcoming week, the pressure gradient will be tightening between the spine of the Brooks Range and the Yukon River, so there'll be some brisker winds set up across that area for the latter half of the week. And overall temperatures are expected to cool down across the state. Not a big cold trend, but cooler than what we've seen here the past week or two. Now, winds will be up Monday with that front pushing into the Panhandle. We're looking at east to southeast gale force winds, either or gusts to 35 knots. Waves could be as high as 10, 11 feet here, Dixon Entrance outside of Metlakatla. Across Stevens Passage with those easterly gale force gusts, waves 4 feet. Look for 3-4 foot waves in Lynn Canal with gusts as high as 35 knots. The outer coast, generally east-southeast winds 35 to as high as 40 knot gust, especially there off of Prince of Wales Island and outside there of the Icy Strait Corridor. Waves generally running 14 feet or so south of Sitka and 10 to 11 feet from the area off of Sitka to Cape Suckling. And then on Tuesday, those winds will have come down as that front weakens. Southeast winds 10 to 15 knots, inner channels, waves generally 2-3 feet, maybe as high as 5-6 feet down here, Dixon Entrance. South of Sitka, look for 10 knot winds out of the south, waves 10-11 feet, and then those winds become southeast to east as you round out outside of Yakutat Bay and Cape Suckling. Northwestern Gulf on Monday, east winds 20 knots within Prince William Sound, 3-4 foot waves. Outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance, we're looking at easterly winds of 25 to 30 knots with waves up to 10 feet. Coming down Cook Inlet, northeast to north winds 20 knots, upper and mid inlet, but then as we get down around Kamishak Bay to the entrance of Cook Inlet, look for west-northwest winds 25 knots, waves around 5 feet. And winds will be lighter on Tuesday. Northeast winds to 10 knots within Prince William Sound, waves there a couple of feet. Look for northeast winds 20 knots outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance. Coming down Cook Inlet, north winds 10 to 15 knots from outside of Anchorage down to off of Anchor Point, and then there in the lower Cook Inlet, northwest winds of 25 knots with waves of 6 to 7 feet. For Monday, Kodiak Island is going to have westerly winds of 20 to 25 knots, waves 5 feet, Shelikof Strait. And look for winds to become more southwesterly and increasing as you go down the length of the Alaska Peninsula. We're going to see winds increase to 35-knot southwesterly gales, especially off of False Pass, where waves could be as high as 12, 13 feet. On the north side, southwest winds 25 to 30 knots with waves of 10 to 15 feet there north of Cold Bay. On Tuesday, winds will be northwesterly 20 knots within Shelikof Strait, easterly 20 knots there on the east side of Kodiak Island, and generally winds having a westerly component across the Alaska Peninsula, around 15 to 20 knots until you get, again, either side there at Cold Bay and False Pass. We're expecting westerly gales to 35 knots. That's going to send waves locally above 10 feet as you get off of False Pass, and in excess of 15 feet as you get north of Cold Bay in the lower Bering. Strongest winds, though, of the forecast period are going to be across the Aleutians. Monday, still 45 to 50 knot storm force winds, eastern and central Aleutians. Again, generally a westerly component. And then by the time we get into Tuesday, those winds will begin to come down and switch up on direction. So we have westerly gales to 35 knots over the far eastern Aleutians around Dutch Harbor on Alaska. As we work our way westward, those winds shift back around to the east, southeast to 30, 35 knots there west of Adak, as there is another low center southwest of the western half of the Aleutians that'll be approaching. Now across the southwest coast and the Pribilovs, southwesterly gales to 35 knots around the Pribilovs with waves as high as 20 feet or so. At least initially into Kuskokwim Bay, southeast winds 50 knots, southwest winds of 15 knots into Bristol Bay. And then as we get farther north, because that primary or original low center coming through the central Bering will be passing north of St. Paul near St. Matthew on Monday afternoon. So easterly winds 15 to 20 knots out of Norton Sound and along the lower Yukon Delta with ice in place there. And then by Tuesday, we're going to find westerly winds of 30 knots around the Pribilovs, waves 15, 17 feet. Northwest winds 15 knots out of Bristol Bay, north winds at 10 knots out of Kuskokwim Bay, and then northeast to north winds out of Norton Sound and along the lower Yukon Delta. Not looking at too much in the way of the ice shifting southward. And then through the Bering Strait on Monday, strongest winds are going to be on the north side of St. Lawrence Island in the vicinity of Gamble, 35-knot northeasterly gales. Otherwise, we're generally looking at northeasterly winds through the Bering Strait around 20 knots. As we go up along the Chukchi Sea coast, locally 20-knot winds off of Cape Lisburne, but otherwise 10, 15 knots. And then along the Arctic coast, strongest winds are going to be here in the vicinity of Point Thompson, Kaktovik, easterly winds to 30 knots, so there could be some blowing snow yet there. And then on Tuesday, winds do come down at Kaktovik, easterly at 20 knots, and then kind of variable. We have southwest winds, Prudhoe Bay, to 10 knots, but more of a northerly wind from Utqiagvik down through the Bering Strait. But those winds are going to increase from 15-knot north winds around Utqiagvik, increasing to 30-knot winds across the far lower Chukchi Sea through the Bering Strait to the north side of St. Lawrence Island on Tuesday. So there could be some shifting of ice with those brisk northerly winds on Tuesday.